welcome to a new masterclass within the Master's Degree in Military History of INISEG. My name is Juanjo Alarcón. I teach China-Taiwan Relations at INISEG, and I'm your host. Today, we go back to World War II, but this time we left the beaches of Normandy on the European Western Front and the Operation Overlord, and we changed them for the warm waters of the Libyan coast in the Mediterranean Sea and the North African and Western Desert campaigns. The Siege of Tobruk in 1941, that is the title of today's lecture, and our distinguished speaker is Mr. Craig Tibbits, Senior Historian of the Australian War Memorial. But before welcoming our guest, we'll begin, as always, with a brief analysis introduction to our topic by Professor David Cashal, who is Director of the Master's Degree in Military History and its Research Group. How are you doing, David? ¿Cómo estás?
Muy bien, gracias, Juanjo. De nuevo aquí para una nueva masterclass tan emocionante como las anteriores.
Perfecto. Nice. So go ahead, please, David, with your presentation. You have the floor.
Ok. Bien, muchas gracias, Juanjo. La masterclass de hoy sobre el asedio de Tobruk de 1941, como bien presentaba Juanjo, hay que recordar y ponernos en ese contexto histórico en la conferencia de hoy, en esta masterclass, que recordemos hasta 1941 el ejército alemán había resultado imbatible al ocupar Polonia, Dinamarca, Noruega, Bélgica, Holanda, Luxemburgo, Francia, Grecia, Yugoslavia y, por supuesto, el Norte de África, cuando el Tercer Reich envió a la Frigate Corps del general Erwin Rommel con el fin de socorrer a las maltrechas tropas del ejército italiano. No obstante, y contra todo lo imaginado por las fuerzas del eje, iba a ser en este último teatro de operaciones donde por primera vez la guerra relámpago, o Blitzkrieg, resultaría detenida frente a las impenetrables murallas de Tobruk. El objetivo, el canal de Suez, que fue la orden, digamos, por el general Erwin Rommel, que transmitió a todas las tropas italo-germanas del eje que debían abalanzarse sobre las posiciones del Imperio Británico en las arenas de Egipto. La operación consistente en avanzar hacia Mersa Matruh para capturar a los contingentes del ejército británico en esa retirada y, evidentemente, alcanzar tanto la ciudad de Alejandría como las orillas del río Nilo. Debía complementarse con un asalto a la fortaleza de Tobruk, que se situaba a espaldas de la Frigate Corps. Por ello, la necesidad de neutralizar Tobruk radicaba en dos motivos. El primero y más importante, que suponía un frente abierto a la retaguardia del eje, en el que los camiones de suministros debían desviarse unos 36 kilómetros aproximadamente de la vía Balbia para alcanzar Egipto. Y el segundo, sus instalaciones y muelles, que eran mucho mejores que las del puerto de Bengasi, donde la Frigate Corps recibía el avituallamiento a contagotas desde Italia. El único problema de esta fortaleza, en muchos casos inexpugnable, era que el ejército alemán tenía que plantear una guerra de asedio sin ser abastecido, y encima con unas fuerzas de maniobra que no estaban preparadas para operaciones estáticas. Lo que no solo hacía difícil la misión, sino que con la pérdida de tiempo que tal cosa suponía, se facilitaría a todo el ejército británico el poder escapar y reorganizarse en el interior de Egipto. Aproximadamente la Frigate Corps reunió en Tobruk 35.000 tropas italo-germanas y 94 tanques que se desplegaron del siguiente modo en Tobruk. Al oeste la 27 División de Infantería Brescia y la 100 División Motorizada Trento. Al sur la 15ª División Panzer, la 5ª División Ligera, más tarde reconvertida en 21 División Panzer, y el 8º Batallón de Ametralladoras. Y en la reserva, en el ADEM, la 132 División Blindada Ariete, mientras que en las etapas finales se añadirían también la 17ª, 15ª y la 53ª División de Infantería Pavia, Bolonia y Savona, más la 90 División Ligera Alemana. En cuanto al plan aliado, la Fuerza del Desierto Occidental, la Western Desert Force, había arrebatado al puerto de Tobruk el ejército italiano durante la Operación Compás, desencadenada en el norte de África por las tropas de la Commonwealth en 1940. Desde entonces, los aliados se habían aprovechado de las ventajas logísticas y defensivas de esta plaza fuerte, que en aquellos momentos se encontraba ocupada por soldados procedentes de Australia, que estaban al mando del general Leslie Morshead, los cuales, curiosamente, eran definidos por el general Erwin Rommel como el cuerpo de élite del ejército británico. Tobruk era un puerto fortaleza rodeado de una muralla coronada por cañones antiaéreos, cuya pared estaba precedida por 3 perímetros defensivos concéntricos, los cuales estaban separados por unos 2.000 metros en intervalos de aproximadamente 500 metros. Se trataba de la línea roja, con 128 puestos fortificados construidos por los italianos antes de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. La línea azul, con erizos de armas antitanque y ametralladoras, y la línea verde, con trincheras para la infantería y refugios subterráneos que comunicaban por pasarelas de unos 3 metros de profundidad. A lo largo de dicho perímetro se había colocado posiciones que incluían una serie de fosos, barreras anticarro, alambre de espinos y pequeñas guarniciones de 90 metros de diámetro con capacidad para albergar a 40 hombres armados, 2 armas automáticas y una pieza anticarro. Y para ir finalizando esta pequeña introducción, Hay que recordar que aproximadamente los aliados reunieron a 35.307 efectivos, 161 cañones, 48 de campaña y 113 anticarro, y 45 carros, de los cuales había 18 Matilda, 16 A9 y 11 Crusader, los cuales se situaron del siguiente modo. La 9ª División de Infantería Australiana se atrincheró dentro de Tobruk, mientras que en el exterior, concretamente cerca de Egipto, se erigió una fuerza de socorro compuesta por la 7ª División Blindada Británica, la 70ª División de Infantería Británica, la 22 Brigada de Guardias, la Brigada de Infantería Polaca de los Cárpatos y el 11º Batallón de Infantería Checoslovaco. Y el resto, para saber qué ocurrirá en el desenlace del asedio de Tobruk y durante la batalla, se lo dejamos al profesor Craig Tibbits para que nos deleite con esta magnífica ponencia. Cuando quieras, Juanjo, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, David, for such a brief and interesting analysis, at the same time, a good appetizer. And now it's time to welcome our guest, Mr. Craig Tibbits. How are you doing, sir? Welcome again to INISEG, and it's an honor for me to meet you. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you very much, Juanjo, and thanks, David. Thanks very much to the INISEG group for inviting me to do another presentation on World War II this time.
Okay, perfect. Mr. Tibbits, please allow me to read your brief resume before giving you the floor. Is that okay with you?
Sure.
Okay. Mr. Craig Tibbits has worked at the Australian War Memorial for nearly 25 years as both an archivist and now a senior historian. He holds a library and archives degree from the University of Canberra and a master's degree in history from the Australian Defence Force Academy. His main areas of interest include mental war wins, the Vietnam War, the First World War, Western Front, and the Second World War, North Africa and the Mediterranean. Well, impressive indeed. And now, without further ado, Mr. Tibbits, go ahead. You have the floor, please.
Thanks again. All right, I'll get straight into it. During the Second World War North African campaign, which lasted almost 3 years, June 1940 through to May 1943, the port town of Tobruk in eastern Cyrenaica, which is today's Libya, was an important place to hold for both sides. Britain and Italy both had interests in North Africa before the war. Both sought to dominate the Mediterranean. The Italians were looking to expand their colonies in North Africa and hopefully eject the British from Egypt. Egypt was vital to the British interest in maintaining control of the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, and protecting their access to oil in the Middle East and further afield in Persia. Situated some 630 kilometres from the Allied main base of supply in Alexandria, in Egypt, and more than 1,000 kilometres by road from Tripoli, which was the Axis main base of supply. Tobruk was roughly at the halfway point between those two bases of supply, a little closer to the Allies, and it was the best port in the area in eastern Cyrenaica, and this was the area that saw the most fighting during the campaign, which is eastern Cyrenaica and into Egypt's western desert. So it was situated sort of right in the cockpit of the fighting in the theatre. It was in fact the only deep water port in eastern Cyrenaica. Even though the port's capacity, we must remember, was relatively small, it was still important for both sides logistically, as each side sought to push the enemy back and forth, east and west, across North Africa. Logistics supplies were always a major problem that dominated the campaign in North Africa. There were great distances to travel and only very few good roads and very little railway at all. So it took enormous quantities of fuel to transport the armies cross-country, and as the size of both armies grew as the campaign went on, this became even more difficult. So controlling whatever small port facilities there were along the coast could really help ease the logistic problem somewhat. It's often been described North Africa as a logistics nightmare because of the difficulties of getting supplies back and forth in the quantities needed. So Tobruk changed hands 4 times during the North African campaign. The Italians held it in 1914, the Allies captured it in January 1941. The Axis forces, Germany and Italy, captured Tobruk in June 1942, and finally the Allies retook it in November 1942 following the Battle of El Alamein. So I'll mention all these briefly, but I will concentrate my presentation on the siege of Tobruk, which lasted 8 months from April to December 1941. It was one of the longest sieges of the Second World War. As far as I can tell, I think the only ones that were a little bit longer were Sevastopol in Crimea, and certainly Leningrad, which was almost 900 days. The Australian 9th Division was the main force that held Tobruk during that siege in 1941, and it has become part of the folklore of Australia's military history and commemoration for that reason. So I'll just touch on briefly with, as I said, Britain and Britain and Italy both had interest in North Africa before the war. Italy declared war on Britain and France in June 1940. They initially had no plans to attack into Egypt, but they took the opportunity in August. Mussolini ordered an invasion of Egypt with a view to booting the British out of Egypt and occupying Egypt and establishing communications with the Italian colonies in East Africa. So the Italian invasion of Egypt actually began in September, and they drove eastwards first to Mersa Matruh, but that all broke down and they ended up digging in around Sidi Barrani, which was about 130 kilometres west of the British defences. And there they stayed, they went no further. On the 9th of December, the counterattack by the British forces, codenamed Operation Compass, which was planned to only be a 5-day foray, ended up driving the Italian forces all the way back out of Egypt, right across Cyrenaica, and ultimately back into Tripolitania. By early January 1941, they'd got to the port town of Bardia, and in just over 2 days' time, the Australian 6th Division, which was its first battle in the war, supported by British tanks and artillery, and air forces, ground forces, and naval forces, they defeated the Italians at Bardia. You can see it on the map there, just to the east of Tobruk, which is marked with the red dot. So about 40,000 Italian prisoners were taken when Bardia was taken. And for the Australian 6th Division, the casualties were relatively light, only 130 dead and 326 wounded. It was around this time that Hitler's naval staff convinced him that the Italian defeat in Cyrenaica was a serious problem, and that with the threat to Egypt removed, the British could not now be driven from the Mediterranean. And that was something that was essential really for control of the Mediterranean and also, as I mentioned, access to the Middle East. So on the 11th of January, just a few days after Bardia fell, Hitler issued his directive number 22, that's on the 11th of January, which was Operation Sonnenblume, Sunflowers, which was providing material German assistance in the Mediterranean theatre. The Allied forces then drove from Bardia towards Tobruk, which is about 100 kilometres further to the west. So, as I've mentioned, it's about 730 kilometres. They're already from their base in Alexandria, so getting further away from their main base of supply. So it's important important to capture Tobruk as it was to get Bardia. So at Tobruk, the Italian 22nd Corps was under General Enrico Manella, occupied defensive positions there in January 1941. They had, I think, about somewhere between 25 and 30,000. The figure I think is actually 27,000 troops there. And Tobruk's defences comprise a series of fortified posts surrounded by wire, minefields and anti-tank ditches. I'll show some images of that in just a minute. Just a couple of images I've got there from the War Memorials collection. These are Italian tanks which were captured by the Australians at Bardia, and you can see the kangaroos, the large white kangaroos painted on the side. So they used these tanks when they drove on Tobruk, and obviously the large kangaroos on the side were there to hopefully help identify them so they wouldn't get shot at by their own men. And this is an artwork from the Australian collection, the Great Hall of Italian prisoners after the fall of Bardia. So the Australians drew up to Tobruk in early January, and on the 21st of January the attack began in the early morning hours. Again, it was the 6th Division, supported by tanks from the Royal Tank Regiment and various other British units, as well as Air Force and Navy. Some of the posts around Tobruk fell quite easily. There were not always. Some of the Italians' posts fought very, very stubbornly as well and inflicted casualties upon the Australians, but they managed to break in to the outer perimeter on the southeastern side and get in there and expand that breach fairly rapidly. So by nightfall on the 21st of January, the western and southwestern sectors, about a third of Tobruk's defences were in Australian hands, and dawn the next day, the 22nd of January, there was a general advance on a broad front. And early that afternoon, the 6th Australian Division entered the town with very little opposition and took the surrender. So overall, there's Italian casualties there. Nearly 800 had been killed, over 2,000 wounded, and over 20,000 became prisoners of war. The other important thing from the fall of Tobruk to the Australians was that there was an enormous amount of captured equipment, especially artillery, and enormous quantities of artillery shells, various smaller weapons, vehicles, tanks, that sort of thing, and also a lot of food and water that was left behind, which would prove to be valuable for the Australian defence during the siege. So following that, the Italians were pressed all the way back to Tripolitania in today's western Libya. At this point, the Germans had almost arrived. So in just 2 months, a relatively small force of British and Australians, the Australians being in their very first fighting of the war, they'd advanced over 800 kilometres and had basically destroyed an Italian army of 4 corps, 10 divisions, and captured about 130,000 prisoners. And as I mentioned, all along the way they captured an enormous amount of equipment as well, to a relatively small cost for the Allied forces. So moving on now to the siege of Tobruk. Just a couple of images there just to show, you can see there's a long sound there where the port is and the town just above it. Quite a large perimeter. That's the the red line. All those red dots are reinforced fighting positions called posts. And then there was an inner defensive blue line, and there was actually a last-ditch resort, a green line as well, much closer to the port. So another image that shows it perhaps a little bit more clearly. Now that perimeter there, the red line, the outer perimeter, that's stretched in an arc for about 45 kilometres in length. Hundreds and hundreds of posts, most of them concrete, but dug into the ground, nothing really above the ground. And those posts were about 500 to 700 metres apart, and put in a checkerboard fashion there, so they could offer mutual support to each other. The ones behind supporting those either side. So, as I said, once the Germans intervened and counterattacked in March 1941, they very rapidly drove the British and Australians back with their fast-moving armoured forces. The Australians and British were at the end of their extended supply lines. A lot of their vehicles and tanks had broken down or in need of repair. So they were pushed all the way back in very rapid order. But the decision was made early on to hold Tobruk. Churchill, in fact, ordered it to be held at all costs. So while the remainder of the British forces retreated to the east, back towards the Egyptian frontier, there was about 35,000 troops remained to garrison Tobruk, and the main portion of those troops were the Australian 9th Division. By this time, the Australian 6th Division had gone to Greece. So the 9th Division, this was their first foray into the fighting, their very first battle. So a lot of their troops were untested, untried. So they had 3 brigades of infantry, also artillery, anti-tank, anti-aircraft engineer signals units, the usual for an infantry division, but they were only partly trained. They didn't have all of their equipment with them. So yeah, it wasn't the ideal situation. British forces that were there as well as part of the 3rd Armoured Brigade, 4 regiments of British artillery, an anti-aircraft brigade, and also a machine gun battalion and an Indian cavalry regiment, which I think might have had armoured cars. I'd have to check that. So yeah, about 35,000 troops. The Axis forces, which was German and Italian, which was the main part of the German force, was the Afrika Korps, led by Erwin Rommel, which was really just constituting at that time on the fly, really, as they attacked. They were sort of forming up. They ultimately, eventually, as they totally besieged the town of Tobruk, they had about 30,000 troops on hand. Italian troops included both armoured and infantry, including divisions such as Arietta, Trento, Brescia, Bologna, Pavia divisions. So as I mentioned, Churchill immediately ordered Tobruk to be held at all costs, and the Commander-in-Chief in the Middle East, Wavell, instructed that the conduct of the defence of Tobruk should be as mobile as possible, and to take any opportunity of hindering the enemy's concentration by offensive action. And this became very much part of the garrison and the Australians' idea on how to manage this siege, because generally with a siege, the idea is that the attacking forces surround the defending forces and cut off all their supplies and just wait until their morale sinks, their supplies sinks, and they eventually give up. So the idea for the Australians was don't behave passively, behave aggressively, and conduct the defence with aggression, and make the besiegers to some extent, feel besieged themselves. And that was an important part of the successful defence of the port town during the siege. Major General Leslie Morshead, who was the commander of the 9th Division, you see there on the left, he said to his troops, "There will be no Dunkirk here. If we should have to get out, we will fight our way out, but there will be no surrender and no retreat." So right from the top, there was a pretty stern idea on what was expected. Opposing him really was, on the right there, Erwin Rommel, who would become famous throughout the North African campaign for his daring exploits. As I mentioned, there were the perimeter was about 45 kilometres in length, so quite a large perimeter for the forces to guard. I'll show a few pictures here now, just to give people an idea of the terrain around Tobruk. Now, as you can see, it's a bit like the surface of the moon. It's no cover at all. It's perfectly flat plateau. The defences had been hewn from the desert, so it's sort of dirt and rock, very difficult to dig into. But nevertheless, building upon what the Italians had built with their defences around the perimeter of Tobruk, the Australians tried to improve those as best they could, and did a pretty good job with that. The whole perimeter was surrounded by an anti-tank ditch, and there were various other anti-tank ditches inside as well. Pretty extensive barbed wire fences, and the use of a lot of minefields as well. There's lots and lots of anti-personnel and anti-tank mines laid about the perimeter. Very hot conditions during the day, obviously more so as it moved into summer, and often very, very cold at night too. So conditions were pretty difficult, especially very little cover to get out of the way of either the elements or enemy fire. There's just another image there. So like some of the positions were built up with a bit of sandbags or rocks, like they call them sangars. And as you can see, barbed wire entanglements in front. Now these defences weren't perfect all the way around. In some places they were stronger than others. In some places the anti-tank ditch was like that, which was nice and deep. But sometimes, if an area was very heavily shelled, that anti-tank ditch would become collapsed and a lot more shallow, and then Italian or German engineers could get in there and try and fill it in, so tanks could get through there and other vehicles could get through there as well. So it wasn't perfect, but at least there was a pretty decent anti-tank ditch that went for most of the area around the perimeter. There's an aerial shot there just to show you the layout of some of the ordinary strong points, the posts. As you can see, they extend about 500-600 meters around the perimeter, and they're all numbered, like it says there, R39, R37, R35, and there was one further inside set in that domino fashion. You can see the anti-tank ditch to the left, and then the barbed wire defences, and in the centre where that circle is, there's trenches, some with a bit of overhead cover, and some concreted positions which would usually have things like you might have an anti-tank gun or a few machine guns, that sort of thing. And they were manned by a relatively small number of men, but just enough to hold it, because they had to spread their forces pretty thinly around all the hundreds of posts that were around the perimeter. Just another couple of images there, just showing, you see how the image on the left there, the photograph has, that's one of the regular type of posts, so concreted in with sandbags, and everything's flush level with the ground. There's nothing really protruding above the ground there at all. That one looks like it's been battered a little bit. It's not the little communications trenches there. Look like they've been caved in a little bit. A little anti-tank gun there as well. These were the little 2-pounders. They didn't get the much better 6-pounders until 1942, I think midway through 1942. These were not very effective, especially against the larger German tanks like Mark III and Mark IV, unless they were very, very close, which you didn't want the tanks to get too close. An example there, this is the typical attire of the Australians in these conditions, similar to Gallipoli in the First World War. They're just shorts and no shirts, and getting some pretty suntanned skin there. Just the siege. The siege began really on the 10th, 11th of April, and Rommel's impatience was to quickly seize Tobruk before the defence could be set, and that saw him launch a small force under von Prittwitz, who was the commander of the 15th Panzer Division. They failed, with the attack floundering in the face of much concentrated fire from the Australians and also from the British artillery and machine guns. As Rommel admitted, we probably tried too much with too little. The commanding officer of the 15th, von Prittwitz, was killed in action on that, I think the evening of the 10th, probing those defences to the southeast of Tobruk. The Australians also made use of a lot of captured Italian artillery just to supplement the British regular artillery as well. So there was plenty of ammunition there. So they were able to, whenever the Germans or Italians were trying to make concentrated breakthroughs into the perimeter, the amount of artillery fire that could be brought down upon them was enhanced by the Australians making use of the captured Italian ones. And if you put a heavy enough artillery fire, even just using not just anti-tank guns but field artillery as well, sometimes just firing over open sights, you could put such a weight of fire down which would often deter the German tanks and turn them back. The Germans did actually force a breach in the outer defences on the 14th of April. So this is known by the Australians as the Easter Battle, because it started on Good Friday and finished on Easter. They were halted by Allied artillery and anti-tank guns. The German supporting infantry made no ground. As soon as they tried to move forward, the Australians, who had allowed the tanks to pass through, they manned their fire steps and weapons pits, and they stopped anything that moved. The Italian infantry and tanks tried again on the 15th and 16th of April, but they were turned back as well. I'll just mention here, the fellow that you see in the image here is Jack Edmondson, and he was the first Australian to win the Victoria Cross posthumously, unfortunately, during the Easter Battle. So it was on the night of the 13th and 14th. His platoon saw very, very heavy action. They had to retake a strong point, and even though he was wounded in a couple of places, he still went forward with his unit into heavy fire and fought the Germans hand to hand. His platoon officer was about to be killed by a German because he was being held down by one, and another was coming in to bayonet him, and he called out to Edmondson. Edmondson came over and bayoneted the German and then pressed on despite his wounds, and killed a few more as well. He was taken back to his post that night, but he died of his wounds early the next morning. As I mentioned, one of the things that the Australians had practiced was to not be intimidated when the German tanks came through. They were actually trained to stay in their foxholes or weapons pits, the little scrapes in the ground. They actually practiced allowing the tanks to go through them because they couldn't really stop them as infantry, and allow the tanks to just roll either through or over their positions, and then they would concentrate on stopping the supporting Italian or German infantry, which would normally be coming through behind. They did in some cases also have the opportunity to attack tanks with, bombs or grenades, that sort of thing, as the opportunity arose. But their main job was to stop the supporting infantry coming through. And it's important for armoured forces to have supporting infantry. So when they were stopped, it made it a lot harder for the German and Italian tanks to maintain their advance. And then they would normally find, without the infantry support and getting hit on all sides by anti-tank guns and field artillery just laying down a barrage, it was usually enough to turn them back. One of the other important things too about the Australian defence, as I said, was not for the defence to be passive. It was important to keep the pressure on the enemy, and they did this by constant patrolling. Now here's just a few photos here. These are really just staged photographs because of the nature of the terrain. You really didn't do the patrolling during the daytime because you'd obviously be seen and cut down. So pretty much all of the patrolling was done at night time. So they would go out through the wire and dominate the no man's land. So, and that was important because if they dominated no man's land, then they would be able to thwart any plans or any actions that the enemy were doing to try and breach their defences at night time. So that was an important thing, and also to keep the enemy forces on edge as well and off balance, not allow them to settle in and become comfortable during the siege as well. So if you can imagine this is just to give you an idea of what the troops looked like. But yes, bear in mind, this happened almost exclusively at night time, where you don't really have photos of it at night time. That's it's actually a diorama from the Australian War Memorial showing aerial attack, which was a constant thing during the siege. The Italian and German air forces put the defences, the perimeter defences, the port and the town under very heavy air bombardment for much of the siege, especially when they realised that they were not going to be able to break in to the defences. They had reasonably good anti-aircraft defences around Tobruk, especially around the port. And during the siege, I think it was about 150 Axis aircraft were shot down over the port. Just a few images here concerning the air raids. It was always something that was difficult in maintaining morale during the siege. Most of the perimeter was further enough away from Tobruk that it wasn't under artillery. The port and the town weren't under direct artillery fire, which is why the Germans had to attack the town and the port with air power. But it was heavy enough that it was sapping the morale. All sorts of German planes like Stukas and various other ones, and Italian planes as well. And the image on the right there is just one of tracer fire, spotlights, and fires on the ground from air raids occurring during the night. And just some of the destruction in the town that occurred from the air raids. I'll just go back. I was also going to mention, apart from, there was only a fairly limited RAF air support at Tobruk, only a couple of squadrons, and the Hurricanes soon became depleted in number, and there wasn't a great deal of air support. So the RAF was a bit overwhelmed, the Desert Air Force, I should say, was a bit overwhelmed by the Axis Air Forces at the time, but as the siege wore on and more Allied Air Forces came into play, that started to change a bit, and the Desert Air Force grew quite significantly from the beginning of the siege to by the end of the siege, or the end of 1941, it had grown much larger, and the tables were starting to be turned as far as the air war in the desert by that time. Also, super important was support from the Navy, predominantly the Royal Navy, and also there was some Australian ships from the Royal Australian Navy there as well. So really, really important, particularly running in supplies, ammunition, food, that sort of thing, bringing in reinforcements where needed, and sometimes taking troops off too. They wanted to try and not have too many troops in there to obviously feed them all and accommodate them all. So the garrison was actually reduced by several thousand men during the siege. And of course the Navy was also important, not only just in providing supplies, but also in taking the wounded away as well. So, which is important help for morale too, to think that if you're wounded, you're not going to be stuck in some horrible place. You could be evacuated to get better medical attention there as well. So it was known as the Tobruk ferry service, really, from Alexandria along the coast to Tobruk, and that was usually because of the threat of air raids, mostly done at night time. So there were Australian destroyers, Napier, Nizam, Stuart, Vendetta, Voyager. There were 2 Australian destroyers were lost during the siege of Tobruk in support to the garrison. One was HMAS Parramatta, which was sunk in late November 1941 by a U-boat not far from Tobruk. You probably heard the British traitor William Joyce, known as Lord Haw Haw, a notorious broadcaster of Nazi propaganda, and he famously referred to the defenders of Tobruk as being caught like rats in a trap. So that's where they got the name, the Rats of Tobruk, and they were very they took on that title very proudly and maintained it through the Rats of Tobruk Association well after the war. The next phase of significant fighting was called the Battle of the Salient, and that occurred right at the very end of April into the first couple of days of May. And that was Rommel's second major assault, I should say, on the Tobruk perimeter. And they captured point 209 and some other posts around it, but it soon ground to a halt. Although on the first day it was a very, very serious situation, and it looked like the Panzer forces might be able to break through the defensive lines and get through the blue line and possibly even reach the town and the port. So it was very, very hard fighting for a few days. But by the end of the 1st of May, instead of Tobruk being taken, as Rommel had expected, he had suffered another defeat, even though he controlled a significant 3 miles of the perimeter and 15 posts the Germans and Italians had managed to capture. So that's why it's called the Battle of the Salient, because there was a chunk of the perimeter defences that were now in Axis hands. And over the next several weeks, the Australians fought very hard to pinch out that salient and regain most of those posts back from the Axis forces. After that, from May onwards, the siege really settled in, and that was the last major attempt by Rommel to try and break through and capture the town. They resorted more and more to just air power and bombing to try and force the garrison into submission. So relieving forces, the British relieving forces, had, by the middle of May, they'd launched Operation Brevity, which was just a 2-day limited attack to secure positions for a subsequent general Allied advance from Egypt, which is now, well over 100 kilometres to the east, so the relieving forces were still a fair way away. An Allied advance towards Tobruk to relieve it. Well, that's the middle of May, and there's still a long time for the siege to go. So, about a month later, the middle of June, there was Operation Battle Axe. This was to be a major attack to force the Allies' way through, back from the Egyptian frontier and hopefully lift the siege of Tobruk, but it failed after just 2 days, so no relief in sight at this stage. So the Australians and the British forces in the garrison in Tobruk, they held on throughout June and July and August. Very, very tough conditions. Not much variety of food to eat. There was dysentery, ill health, very poor living conditions, and very cramped. During the day you couldn't get out of your fighting positions at all, because, as I said, the terrain was so flat. Snipers would get you, or artillery would get you, so you had to just stay in really hot conditions, unhealthy conditions underground, just in your foxholes and the concrete fighting positions. You get out at night time, but you might be going on patrol, and sometimes very, very cold, so it was pretty tough conditions. So eventually the Australian government called for the Australian troops to be relieved by other troops, because they'd been there so long and they needed to be pulled out and rested and refitted. So the first portion of the Australian forces was actually relieved in August, and then the rest of them, during September and October. These were staged relief, and there was a division of Polish troops who you see pictured there speaking to some Australians in a machine gun pit. There was a British division and Polish division. There was one Australian unit that they were unable to be pulled out because the ship that they were going to be pulled out on had to turn back the night that was happening, so they ended up staying there for the entire siege. That was the 2nd 13th Australian Battalion, part of the 9th Division. So Operation Crusader, which would ultimately lead towards the relief of the siege, that began on the 18th of November 1941. It was a much bigger, more concentrated counterattack by the British forces, but it still took nearly 3 weeks of very heavy fighting from the 18th of November onwards, until they were eventually able to wear down Rommel's forces and break through and lift the siege. Rommel's forces began abandoning the siege of Tobruk and heading westwards on the 7th of December, and ground communications with the garrison of Tobruk re-established the same day, and the siege was broken. So altogether, I'll just see what other slides I have here. I'll just go back, I'll show that one later. Altogether, the Allies during the siege suffered almost 6,000 casualties. Axis forces about double that number. Usually that happens when you're attacking against a fortified position, that you'll suffer a lot more casualties. The Australian 9th Division's casualties during that period of the siege were 749 killed, just under 2,000 wounded, and during the course of the siege 467 captured by Italians and Germans. So the aftermath of the siege was that the British, by now it was called the Eighth Army, which was created during the siege back in Egypt. They drove the Axis forces once again all the way back to Tripolitania. But as before, as you know, during the course of the fighting in the North African campaign, it was usually sweep one way all the way to the west and then all the way to the east and back and forth. They're sometimes described as a seesaw campaign. As before, Rommel's forces regrouped, resupplied, reinforced, and so by January, 21st of January, launched another offensive back towards Egypt. That then turned into Operation Venice, otherwise known as the Battle of Gazala, which opened on the 26th of May 1942. Now, Gazala is a little to the west of Tobruk. And there was 3 weeks of very, very tough fighting again. And this time the decision was, once the Germans and Italians broke through, Tobruk actually fell in just one day, the 21st of June. And there was no desire for the Allies to try and repeat the siege of 1941 and try and hold it. They fell back into Egypt with the Axis forces in hot pursuit all the way back to the Alamein line, well into Egypt. The Battle of El Alamein then played out between July right through to the end of October, when they launched the major counter-offensive on the 23rd of October from El Alamein. Again, after a couple of weeks of very, very heavy fighting, they finally broke through. El Alamein was really the turning point in the North African campaign, drove the Italians and Germans all the way back, and retook Tobruk just a few days later on the 13th of November. Let's see what else. I think it's just with regards to significance, the protracted defence of Tobruk had two important effects. Number one, it prevented Rommel from shortening his lines of communication by having access to the port, and also there was substantial, about 30,000 troops in his rear. So while he could drive on Egypt, he still needed a lot of troops to hold the siege of Tobruk. And it was also a really important boost to Allied morale at the time. Now, when you consider what else was going on, it was actually a pretty bad time in that theatre. It was really important to hold Tobruk as something positive in the Mediterranean, Middle East. During the course of the siege of Tobruk, bad things happened for the Allies, such as the disaster in Greece and the loss of Crete. They also had to fight the Vichy French in Lebanon and Syria. There was a sudden coup d'etat in Iraq, which had to be dealt with. And there was stuff going on in East Africa as well. So there was a lot of dangerous situations, and not all of them were going very well, but ultimately they were able to turn their fortunes around somewhat by the end of 1941, at least for a time, and an important part of that was the successful defence of Tobruk. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Tobruk, because it was very much dominated by Australian forces during the siege, and it was successful, it became a significant point of focal point for commemoration and folklore in Australian military history, and has done so ever since. This is Tom Pritchard, who was actually the last rat of Tobruk, and he died just a few weeks ago at age 102. So the last of the Australian rats of Tobruk are now passed into history, but never forgotten. Okay, so happy to take those questions now, just as I run through some of the sources and credits for the material I've used in the presentation. Just image credits there, mostly from the Australian War Memorials collections, and there's lots and lots of good sources. These are just some of the ones that I've looked at for Tobruk. So as you can see, 1944, they started writing about Tobruk before the war was even over, and people are still writing about Tobruk these days. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Tibbits, for such a remarkable lecture. Very interesting indeed. We have truly enjoyed it. Now it's time for questions and answers, sir. We have 3 questions from our students of the master's degree on military history, and possibly 1 more from David or from me. Okay?
Okay. Yes.
So let's start with first question. Goes like this. Tobruk was a strategic base and port of Italian Libya. After June 1940, the Italian 10th Army invaded Egypt, weakly defended by British colonial army. However, the Italian offensive stalled, and the British launched Operation Compass, inflicting important defeats on the Italian fascists. Do you think the Italian army was sufficiently trained, equipped, and commanded to confront, at the end of the day, British units in the desert? What do you think?
Well, the simple answer is no. I don't think the Italian 10th Army was none of those things, really. They were not adequately prepared, trained, not adequately equipped or commanded to carry out the successful invasion of Egypt. And, in fact, the commanders of the army, and some even higher, were just really against the idea of launching an invasion into Egypt. So, when your commanders are not really convinced that it's a good idea, the motivation right from the very beginning is not good, and you certainly don't want that. So consequently, I think that the Italian 10th Army suffered from low morale. At that stage, they were poorly trained. Not all, but a lot of the units were. Pretty indifferent leadership, as I've said, even from the top level. Other more practical things, that they had a chronic lack of transport, especially trucks. So consequently, their largest formations, the infantry, they were not able to be transported by vehicle at all. They were on foot. Other problems were that their armoured vehicles, as you saw those little Italian tanks, they were not modern nor large enough or powerful enough, especially once they came up against British tanks such as the Matilda tank, and a lot of their other weaponry, like anti-tank guns and artillery, were also no match for the British more modern ones at the time. Not that the Italians necessarily had a universal lack of fighting spirit. They're in places such as Sidi Barani and Bardia, and the Italian defence of Tobruk. There's some Italian troops did fight very well and fought very hard, but the majority did not, and I think their leadership collapsed, and that's why you saw such enormous amounts of Italians surrendering, being taken prisoner, well over 100,000. So that's an indication that they were not prepared, not well trained, not well enough equipped. So hopefully that answers.
Okay, thank you very much. Second question. Operation Sonnenblume allowed the forming of Rommel's Africa Corps with new reinforcements. At the end of March, German troops arrived in Libya, counterattacked, and headed for the Egyptian border, taking advantage of Britain giving priority to the war in Greece. Do you think that the North African theater was a secondary area, as Hitler called it, or was it vital to weaken the Italo-German forces and prevent them from taking Egypt?
Yeah, I think certainly for the Germans it really was a secondary theatre. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the Mediterranean and North Africa was of more importance to the Italians and British. I think it was, for the Germans, it was a bit of an annoyance, really. I mean, they focused their strategic objectives was really also in Europe, and obviously they were preparing by mid-1941 for their major strategic objective was, after defeating the Western Allies, was to attack and conquer the Soviet Union. So I think for the Germans and Hitler, the ideal situation would have been if the Italians could have secured southern Europe and the Mediterranean and held the colonies in North Africa, and possibly even ejected the British from Egypt. Ideally for the Germans, if the Italians had been able to do that by themselves, maybe with a bit of limited German support, that would have been ideal. But they were unable to do that, and they increasingly needed more and more German support as the campaign went on, and as we saw the Allies grow stronger in the Middle East and North Africa, more and more resources, increasingly German resources, were being dragged down into that theatre, where they really needed those weapons, tanks, planes, men. They really needed them on the Eastern Front. They really could not afford to be sending them, but they had to try and prop up what was happening in the Middle East. So as the campaign in North Africa went on, it drew more and more Axis resources, including more and more German resources to it. So it did play a part in weakening Axis forces and wasting their resources. And it was important for the British and Allies to hold Egypt. So while on the one hand they were wasting the Axis forces in the Mediterranean and North Africa, it was also important because it was at that stage, especially 1941, 1942, it was really the only place that the British and Commonwealth forces were actually fighting on the ground on a large scale against the Germans and Italians. So it gave them some experience in warfare and taught them some lessons on, how they could possibly defeat the Axis forces on the ground. And then by the end of 1942, the Americans became involved as well, and there was pretty significant forces in North Africa. And when you think of the end of the campaign with the Axis surrender at Tunis in May 1943, that's an enormous loss for them. Was I think it's 230,000 troops taken prisoner there. So something on the scale of losses at Stalingrad, which had happened only a couple of months before. So twin blows there. The enormous losses and surrender at Stalingrad by February 42, and then February 43, and only a few months later at Tunis in May 43, another enormous loss of troops and equipment.
Okay, thank you. Question number 3, maybe you have already answered it, but anyway, having in account that Tobruk was besieged for 240 days, can we consider Rommel's victory at Tobruk as a Pyrrhic one? Could Rommel have won the war in North Africa with the supplies and forces at his disposal?
So Rommel's capture of Tobruk, so we're talking there after the siege, so we're talking about Rommel's capture of Tobruk on the 21st of June 1942, when they captured it in just one day. I wouldn't really call it a Pyrrhic victory, because normally that sort of victory entails enormous losses for the victor. Even though they won the battle, the losses are prohibitively high. But that wasn't the case. I mean, they suffered losses during the lead up to capture of Tobruk, but just the capture of Tobruk in June 1942, very few losses for German and Italian forces. So I wouldn't say Pyrrhic victory. The capture of Tobruk in June 1942 was really the final key victory in what I would consider Rommel's greatest battle, which is the Battle of Gazala, which had begun on the 26th of May, where it made a wide flanking manoeuvre to the south of the Gazala line. So the capture of Tobruk was the culminating point in that. After that, the Allied forces basically fled eastwards back across the frontier into Egypt until they were able to stop at the and form up a defence at the Alamein line. Now, as far as the question goes, could Rommel have won the war in North Africa with the supplies and forces at his disposal? I think the simple answer is no, because I don't think he ever really had adequate forces or supplies necessary. There were times when it looked like he might be able to break through, but the Allies were always able to find enough resources. They had enough resources there. They had the Navy, at least by that stage, controlling the Eastern Mediterranean. The Desert Air Force was growing. The American Air Forces were starting to come in as well. There was always more forces back in the Delta and Cairo and in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon. For example, that critical time just after the fall of Tobruk in June, when Rommel's forces dashed into Egypt and they were stopped at the El Alamein line at the beginning of July, as an example of what the Allied forces in the theatre could draw on, was the Australian 9th Division, the very same men who had defended Tobruk during the siege in 1941. They were stationed in Palestine, Syria and Lebanon. So once the Germans broke through, Rommel's forces broke through, they were immediately called up and rushed back into Egypt, and they helped stabilise the line and stop any further progress. And then during the next months, and especially during the battle, the big counter-offensive that began on the 23rd of October at El Alamein, that Australian 9th Division played a really important role in that successful battle too. So, yeah, I think the answer is Rommel never had adequate supplies. It was always difficult because their lines of supply got longer and longer and longer, and when they were back in Egypt, the Allies' supplies lines were shorter, and they were growing stronger all the time, and the Axis forces were growing weaker, and it was getting more and more difficult for them to get things across the Mediterranean as well. A lot of their shipping was getting sunk. So, and really, the German High Command did not want to give Rommel the forces that he really needed to be able to break through, because, as I said, they were needed in Russia.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, David. If you have a question for our guest, do it now, please.
Yes, thank you. A question, Craig. Excuse me. Do you believe that the British Navy was instrumental in maintaining the defense of Tobruk, supplying ammunition and supplies?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, as always, the Navy always plays a really important role, and as I said at some point during the presentation, the idea of a siege, if you're the besieging forces, is you're supposed to be able to totally surround the besieged and cut them off fully from all their supplies, in which case you can sort of choke the life out of them and just wait till they wither on the vine and surrender. But because of the efforts of the Navy, the Royal Navy, which includes some Australian ships, they were able to maintain communications via sea. So they were really vital in bringing in supplies, taking out men that weren't needed there, and also evacuating the wounded. And it was pretty costly to the Navy as well, was pretty hotly contested with, getting attacked from the air, and also the threat of U-boats. As I mentioned, one of the Australian ships was sunk by a U-boat off Tobruk, which is why they had to conduct a lot of those naval operations into and out of Tobruk at night time to make it safer.
Thank you very much, Kai, for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tibbits, Mr. Craig Tibbits, for your answers and for your speech, for your lecture. By the way, I would like to say that Mr. Tibbits got up extremely early today at 4 a.m. in Australia to deliver this lecture. So, for which we are very, very, truly grateful. Thank you very much for your effort.
That's okay. I got a couple of hours sleep, and I got up, and then now I'll go back to bed for a couple of hours.
Okay, perfect. Well, now I'm afraid. Now I'm afraid it's farewell time, sir. So, but we hope to see you again soon in another masterclass here at INISEG, if you don't mind. If you have more material to show to the public, we are kind to give you this venue, this opportunity, whenever you want to talk again about World War II, World War I, or other subjects of your expertise. Okay,
I'm happy to help wherever I can.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome. And thank you to David too for your contribution today and in every masterclass. And finally, thank you to our audience for being with us one more time. Please remember, visit INISEG website, which is www.iniseg.es, to keep post about our next masterclass. So for today, bye-bye. See you next time. Take care, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Tibbits. See you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.